In today's episode of Quick Chat, I speak to Dario Morelli, who shares his journey through to becoming the head of AI at Admiral Group. He discusses his early interest in analytics, the transition to AI, and the challenges faced in building scalable data infrastructure. Dario highlights the evolving applications of AI in insurance, particularly in fraud detection and generative AI, while emphasizing the importance of data ethics and compliance. He also shares insights on continuous learning in AI and the future potential of AI agents in complex operations. If you found this episode helpful, leave us a like, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hey Dario, thanks for taking the time to do this podcast. Obviously, you've had an impressive journey through AI and analytics. Love to know almost what initially sparked your interest in the field.
Sure, thank you for having me, first of all. So we go back a few years now, about 15 years, and I really started in a fairly roundabout way. So at that time, I was working for this music copyrights company called Scalable Music.
Okay.
And I started as a copyright assistant doing really operational tasks, largely in Excel.
Mhm.
And as I got to learn Excel, I realized that I could automate a bunch of things that made my work easier. And as
Sure.
people recognized that, they thought, oh, okay, so can you do a little more and a little more? And by, let's say, a year or so, I had really felt I had exhausted the possibilities of things that I could do within Excel. And so without really calling it analytics, I thought, okay, perhaps there's something else I can do. I just don't know exactly what that is. And then I asked around and realized that SQL was actually a thing. And I thought, okay, how can I get access to this? So I went to my CTO back then and I asked whether it was possible to get access to one of our databases so I could practice. And quite kindly, he said, no, sorry, you're not going to get access because you don't have any experience. So I thought, okay, I'll see you in a few months. So I went to purchase an O'Reilly book about
Okay.
300-page thick. It was a SQL certification for Oracle. I studied that all the way through from A to Z, set the exam, passed, came back to work and said, okay, I am now an Oracle SQL certified expert as per the exam. Can I have access now? And at that point, they couldn't say no. So that was my foray into databases. And then as I got to like SQL and became a bit of an expert, at least within my team and after that within the company, I realized that there's certain things I could not really do with SQL, which led me to Python. And I thought, okay, that's something new. So I picked it up on my own. I went to a couple of boot camps during the evenings out of my own pocket, and I really loved it. And that's where I started to think in terms of data science, application of Python to real business problems. I liked it so much that then I dedicated 2 years to a master's in business analytics from Imperial College. And that opened all sorts of doors later on for me. But I would say overall, it was really the realization that a certain tool was good for certain things. And my intellectual curiosity almost inevitably took me to the next stage, which leads me now to AI as being really the primary part of my role.
And was there just when you moved from sort of SQL to Python, was there a kind of pivotal moment there that made you say, okay, no, I definitely need to take this language a step further?
I simply ran out of roles in Excel.
Okay.
It was
No, fair enough.
as simple as that. So I realized that I needed more than 1 million rows, or at least my data sets had to be bigger than 1 million rows. And clearly, when I was working for the music company, there were pioneers back then in digitizing certain types of royalty information that would make them very easy to analyze, but not in Excel. And so when I finally got access to a read-only replica of our database and I could start running some serious queries, then I realized, okay, it's not so much the number of rows that I need, but the thinking and how I want to aggregate those rows, manipulate them for insight. And so that was an initial physical limitation of Excel, but that really opened the door to thinking about the problems I was tackling in a completely different way.
Absolutely. And do you mind almost walking me through a bit as an overview of your kind of career journey to get to the point at where you're at?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I started at Koba Music
Yeah.
fairly large, I would say, independent music company that was facing giants like Universal,
Right.
EMI, and Sony. And one of the ways that he was taking them head on was the fact that he was very data driven in its
Hmm.
approach on how it was signing artists, how it was paying our royalties. So a lot of my career journey really starts with being very lucky to be at a company at that time within a growing ecosystem. Remember, it
Hmm.
was 2008, 2010, so around about the time that Spotify was starting to launch. And so the revolution of digital music and particularly microtransactions
Hmm.
really made sense in the context of big data. If
Right.
you were in music in the 70s, maybe you would get one royalty check once every quarter. But if you
Sure.
start processing millions and then trillions of microtransactions in a given quarter, that becomes a big data problem straight
Hmm.
away. And
Hmm.
so I went from a very heavily operational role earlier on
Hmm.
to almost commercial analytics by the end of my tenure there, purely by chasing the next big problem that I could get my hands on
Right.
with new technology that I learned along the way. I'm just going to
Hmm.
close on a highlight, which I think was really interesting towards the end of my tenure there. The company really had a strong pivot towards Latin America. I
Okay.
was working at that time very closely with a senior sponsor based in Miami that was in charge effectively of growing our portfolio of royalties coming from Latin American markets. So I was lucky enough to travel all around Argentina, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, Colombia, you name it, because I could speak Spanish, but equally, I
Hmm.
could assist our senior sponsor with numbers that would make those conversations easier with the local countries we were trying to enter into a relationship with, saying, this is the earning potential that we've got now. If things stay on track, and if we sign these artists like we think we would,
Hmm.
you, partner, will make this percentage of royalty share. And this is how much we're going to keep. So a lot of those projections were really, let's say, not groundbreaking, but let's say fairly advanced
Sure.
considering the level of analytical maturity that we were finding in these countries. And so that was really exciting. By the end of my tenure there, I was also starting my master's, like I mentioned earlier. And
Uh-huh.
so I didn't know exactly where that was going to end up. But 6 months in, I ended up getting an offer from this financial services company called TrueLayer,
Yeah.
which even today is probably the largest open banking network in the UK,
Hmm.
being effectively a API supplier to the likes of Revolut, Nutmeg, big investments firms, big merchants, to facilitate payments from
Hmm.
these big merchants to end users that want to use open banking rails. The company at that time, TrueLayer, I think was in the first 3 or 4 rounds of investment, so fairly
Okay.
early. I was employee 100 and something.
Wow.
And unlike previously, the stack was very modern technologically. So we had microservices, Kubernetes, etc.
Hmm.
But the CTO and co-founder that I was reporting into was very humble when he said, listen, I'm an engineer at heart. I really understand this stuff well, but I don't know enough about data. Help us
Sure.
out. And so the challenge was very different from the music industry in that the technology was super modern on the software side, but there was
Hmm.
very little in terms of data stack.
Hmm.
So I started with a data engineer who was absolutely brilliant and was effectively my technical complement in making this thing work. So it was a duo in the beginning. And he really did a fantastic job setting up the data infrastructure, the basic of the tech stack, while at the same time, I was trying to come up with a data strategy, with getting some quick requirements built so that we could have a proof of value for the business to see how that could actually evolve into an asset for the company. Fast forward 3 years, at its
Hmm.
peak, the team was about 12 people
Uh-huh.
serving the whole business horizontally, from commercial, operations, product, engineering, and really being a center of excellence, you could call it, or a hub
Hmm.
for the various initiatives that could be, again, anything from calculating certain metrics for product utilization, revenues, engineering downtime, latency, availability, you name it.
I've got
At the
a
end, oh,
I've
please.
got a question just on that. Obviously, that's really fast growth, especially for a team. And you joined at the early stage, and then 3 years down the line, the team grows. Your specific team grows to 12 people. obviously building a scalable and cost-effective data platform, it's difficult, it's a huge challenge. How did you kind of overcome those challenges as the company evolved and grew as well?
That's a great question. So by design, we wanted to keep our infrastructure as lean as possible. To give you
Okay.
an example, at the beginning, we said, okay, we need three things foundationally. We need to
Hmm.
store our data somewhere.
Hmm.
We need to be able to query it, and we need to be able to visualize. That's it. We don't need anything else. We don't need a data warehouse. We don't need DBT. We
Right.
certainly don't need anything fancy. To top that and make everything work from an operational perspective, we'll need an orchestrator. We use
Hmm.
Airflow, one of the standard tools in the open source ecosystem, just because that was really sufficient for what we had to do. As the complexity of our initiatives evolved, then we realized, okay, probably in doing this, we built some tech debt. For
Hmm.
example, we had a sprawl of tables of views that was getting difficult to manage. And so we realized, okay, about 2 years in, what is the best practice here? We need DBT in order to manage our data assets, our data models properly. What does DBT really work well with? A data warehouse. Now that we are 2.5 years in, we have much clearer, stricter, and well-defined requirements that would not have made sense at day zero, but make sense 2.5 years in, purely because now we understand the business a lot better. And thanks to our early efforts, you could say that the business understands itself better. And we are able to separate what is a critical data element as opposed to something that is not. So I would say the underlying philosophy was always to stay as lean as we possibly could. But we evolved our technological stack as our requirements and initiative grew in complexity, as the ambitions grew from the business that we could solve more complex problems and bring more value.
Absolutely. And I guess how does that compare now to your work at Admiral Group? Obviously, TrueLayer, it's a fast-growing company to now an insurance giant that's been around for a long time. So how does that compare?
Well, it's a fundamentally different company. So I've
Hmm.
only, until April this year, I'd only have worked for startups or scale
Yeah.
ups. So purely from a number of people perspective, we are talking orders of magnitude. So Cobalt, my first company at its peak, was about 600-700 people.
Hmm.
Amiro is about 13,000 and counting at the minute. It's a profitable company. It's listed on the London Stock Exchange. In the first half year results, it posted something along the lines of 3-4 billion in sales, 360 million in profits. It's a level of scale that for me was unheard of. And equally, it has a huge ambition to move outside of the UK, its
Hmm.
core market by far,
Hmm.
into Europe and the US. And that's really where a lot of my focus is nowadays. So I work as head of artificial intelligence and AI
Hmm.
on the EU side of things. So supporting Admiral in its efforts to diversify primarily in Italy, France, and Spain, and a little bit in the US as well. So from a
Hmm.
technological perspective, I found a completely different level of maturity. So thanks to the CDO, Paola, the lady I'm reporting to, there
Hmm.
was already a 2-year transformation that had been going on for, again, a couple of years. And so I
Right.
found myself at the turning point where already a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the infrastructure had been done. The team existed already, had been around for a couple of years. There
Hmm.
are people with different levels of seniority, pretty smart data scientists that have done anything from claims, pricing, fraud analytics, so a fairly broad spectrum of things,
Yeah.
even though the bread and butter admiral is certainly pricing. And
Yeah.
then from the processes perspective, that's where I saw perhaps a little bit of hesitance in going all in with AI and really putting some strong foundation to scale those processes and extract the highest possible value. And that's where I've been focusing on these past few months, honing those processes and ensuring that the countries that we support can benefit from the expertise of a central team that we manage in the UK and
Hmm.
equally grow their ambitions with the initiatives that they can tackle by sharing some of the insight and the knowledge that they have from their local markets with the best practice and standards and breadth of technologies and tools that we can better harness here in the UK. So it's that collaboration, those processes that have really taking a lot of my time to fine-tune and optimize to make the outcomes as valuable as they can be.
Something you mentioned that's quite interesting that I hear a lot about as well is sort of the use in AI in fraud analytics, and sort of I'd love to know from your perspective how you're using AI to detect fraud and how that's changed to sort of pre-AI.
So anti-fraud has been around for a very long time. Since banking has been around, there's always
Hmm.
been a necessity to tackle a very small percentage of fraudulent behavior. The bread and butter of anti-fraud is very much rule-based, even at TrueLayer. There was a lot of emphasis on rules purely because they can capture an awful lot of the obvious fraudulent behaviors. And that level of sophistication is exactly right. You shouldn't over-engineer it for
Right.
types of frauds that you've seen before. That's
Hmm.
where rule-based works extremely well. On top of that, the machine learning element also helps when it looks at historical patterns, which, however, are harder to code into rules compared to the basic anti-fraud rules that your classic
Hmm.
fraud team will have in place. So if you
Hmm.
want to spot more complex patterns, but still have a ground truth for what is fraudulent and was not, and a long history, a large data set that you can mine, I think machine learning and techniques around supervised learning particularly really help you there. Then there is a branch of machine learning that we can also use when it looks at unsupervised learning, so clustering, anomaly detection, that don't necessarily rely on a ground truth being already inherent in the data set. But based on certain behaviors, certain patterns in the data set, we'll be able to tell you with a certain level of confidence whether a pattern is unusual enough to be cast as fraudulent. Something of a bit of an evolution that we're seeing today is instead fraud analytics combined with the concept of graphs. So
Right.
think of graphs as a simple network. You and I are connected. Imagine that we can be nodes in a network and we are connected by an arrow or an edge. Okay? That edge establishes our relationships. You and I know each other because we're doing this podcast.
Sure.
Now, take an insurance kind of use case.
Hmm.
You could have a node, which is a policy. You can
Hmm.
have another node, which is a driver. And those two things are connected because the drivers bought the policy. And then you can have another node, which is the car. And you can
Hmm.
say that the driver is connected to the car because the driver bought the car. Now, put that at scale. What
Yeah.
if we said one of those drivers has a history of fraudulent behavior? And what if they have multiple policies
Hmm.
linked to them? And what if they have multiple cars? And what if they are connected to other people in their network by a distance of, let's say, 1 degree or
Hmm.
2 degrees? How does that impact the likelihood of that next driver also potentially being
Right.
fraudulent? You are taking effectively something that is very well understood when it comes to social media, measures of centrality in network analysis, traversing graphs, and applying that to fraud to say if rules can solve some very basic use cases and machine learning can solve the next level of interactions of patterns, here we're looking at how the players in the network play with each other and give us a much more nuanced, much richer pictures, not just of a static data set, but of
Hmm.
the game that these different interactions
Right.
can play in the system. And it's really, really interesting. So we're having some new approaches being tested as we speak, and they are proving to be potentially very valuable. So I can't say too much here, but
Sure. Of course.
the approaches are absolutely valuable and worth looking into. I would highly recommend it.
Wow. No, that sounds really interesting. I guess I don't know if you can say this or not, but if let's say my brother was a fraudulent driver, what percentage increased likelihood does that make me one?
Well, I'm not going to put a number on that. That is more for you.
No, I appreciate that. I guess one step further than that as well is potentially the use of Gen AI as well in insurance. And I'd kind of love to pick your brain a bit about where you're seeing the specific application of Gen AI in insurance.
So I can speak of a couple use cases which you've seen quite a lot in the industry and that we have had some initial success with as well. One is that of chatbots, and the other
Okay.
one is that of intelligent document processing. So let me start with chatbots.
Sure.
One of Admiral's brands is called Vago, and it targets a specific segment of the market that is after short-term insurance. You need an insurance just for 2 weeks, 1 week, 1 day, it doesn't really matter. But given the market, it tends to work very well with younger drivers.
Okay.
So Vago, these brands already had a chatbot solution on their website, which, however, wasn't working particularly well. The feedback that we were getting wasn't great. So one of the data scientists within my team worked very closely with Vago's CTO, leadership, and people on the ground to understand what is a Gen AI application that is going to make it more interactive, is going to get a better tone than what we're getting now, and just make the information retrieval much easier. We went live with this chatbot. Now it's been already a few weeks ago, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. We are tracking interactions. We are trying to see whether the NPS has improved. And I think the indication here is definitely yes. What that means is that if you put the time to understand your knowledge base, if you turn that into something that can be better leveraged with a front end, in this case, the chatbot that feeds off of that, if you put guardrails in place to make sure that those conversations are of a good standard, that the chatbot doesn't hallucinate more than it needs to, for a certain segment of customers, like we've seen with Vago customers, relatively young, that pattern of interaction seems to work very well. So what I'm saying is Admiral is a huge group. Perhaps that approach wouldn't be exactly the same plug and play somewhere else. But in this case, for that subset of customers, younger customers within Vago, there was exactly the right product market fit. What is the second? Oh, please.
Yeah, I just guess like for me when I hear that, how do you almost safeguard the chatbot from giving, I don't know, almost like a wrong suggestion or getting the policy wrong as well?
So one thing we should say for sure is 100% accuracy today. Even OpenAI will not guarantee that.
Yeah.
And since most companies, instead of building their own AI engine, they partner
Yeah.
with OpenAI, with Google Vertex AI, with Amazon's Bedrock, they also need to accept the fact that there will be instances when the information is not going to be 100% correct. In our case, funny enough, these brought up some parts of our own knowledge base, which perhaps was up to date, was not up to date as it should have been. So in this case, what really made the difference was not the fact that the answers were wrong, but the fact that the answers were consistently wrong, in that he pointed to a section of the knowledge base that perhaps was out of date, and therefore prompted somebody that owned that part of the business to say, oh, actually, this thing has changed. And this is why we're getting the wrong answer, because the knowledge base needs updating. So that was an exercise in understanding Gen AI, but equally creating a positive feedback loop where accepting the risk, the small risk of an incorrect answer, really allowed us to be more effective in keeping our knowledge base in as good a state as possible. So overall, I would say that was a valuable exercise.
And then from that, the Gen AI then learn the correct way.
Yes, but it's a feedback loop. So your like the usual, your output is only going to be as good as your input.
Yeah.
If there are, as there always are in a company that moves very fast, some updates in your knowledge base and you haven't picked those up, inevitably the Gen AI engine is going to get back to you with something incorrect. But we've taken an approach of fast iterations to pick up on the most obvious and consistently recurring errors to feedback in our knowledge base and update that accordingly.
No, that makes sense. Appreciate that explanation. I guess obviously as you're integrating these systems into your existing systems brings about quite a few challenges. I'd love to almost know the hurdles you faced when applying AI into existing systems and sort of how you've overcome them as well.
In this case, perhaps the second work stream is more appropriate because it's very complicated from an operational perspective. So if you've ever had a claim with one of your insurance companies, you will know that you have to submit a claim.
Yeah.
The claim handler needs to go and review this information manually, needs to extract sensitive information in order to kick off the claiming process. It might take a certain amount of time. Now, a lot of companies are exploring intelligent document processing use cases where the Gen AI can help together with other more established technologies like OCR, so optical recognition, and blending the two together, you get the best of both worlds in that a simple document, perhaps OCR will give you sufficient results.
Sure.
But when you want to look at more complex documents where perhaps there is an element of logic within that document, is not just reading it sequentially, that's where GenAI really boosts the level of accuracy and coverage that you can get from this approach. What is the problem? Moving from POC to production. We've been very lucky in having a huge support network where even at the POC stage, we are involving stakeholders that are going to be the final users of this solution and get their feedback as early as possible. Why? Because otherwise you end up in what some people call the cemetery of POCs.
Sure.
What is that? Is 1, 2, 3 POCs that never make it to production. And inevitably, they make the AI organization look like they can never get to the finish line. They can never bring the ROI that they promise. So in this case, to avoid that scenario, we deliberately chose only a couple of use cases, but where we had already established a baseline of a good metric that could move the needle for the business. For claims, it could be time of resolution. It could be number of hours spent by a claim handler scrolling through endless document and making their job a little bit easier to manage. So now that we're at the stage where we're putting it in production, we need to move to a different level of complexity that is really beyond the GenAI. There is more instead in the realm of security, compliance, making sure there is no unintended behavior before we roll it out to a large population. So those considerations would be premature at the POC stage. But as you're building the POC, you cannot wait until the POC is done to see what's next.
Yeah.
And again, compliance, legal obligations, regulatory necessities, if this is something that, again, your use case warrants. It's not something that you can wait until the last day. You really need to get the ball rolling so that you're ready. When the POC brings the results that you want, you can already move to the next phase.
I guess something you mentioned there as well on the topic of sort of sensitive information regulation as well. What steps do you take to ensure almost data privacy and ethical use of AI in the company, especially in the context of your clients and customer information?
So obviously, as an insurance company, we are very heavily regulated when it comes to pricing. If we're making any changes that we feel are substantial enough that they require regulatory scrutiny, we will go to the regulators. And we have obviously internal audits as well to make sure that there is no inherent bias, that we haven't inadvertently, let's say, put some unwanted condition on a certain segment of our book. So fairness, transparency, avoiding bias is really key in anything that we do. When there is an obvious risk, like in this case, potentially giving unfavorable prices to certain segments of the population. When it's internal use cases, obviously it's different, but still we have a strong data ethics team. I'm very lucky that Admiral is taking this extremely seriously. And so by default, almost, we go through all the various ethical steps when we review a model and say, does it have any inherent bias? Can we explain it? Do we have any variables that perhaps are interacting, creating an unfavorable outcomes? And there is a suite of tests that we just go through together with our data ethics team to make sure that none of those conditions are met. And if they are, we go and fix them. So in this sense, Amiro has got an excellent maturity when it comes to data ethics, purely because they really invested in building the team that takes this extremely seriously. One of the things that we're going to have to face now is also regulation from the EU. As I mentioned, I deal specifically with European businesses. And so the EU AI Act is already a reality. We are having to take a similar approach when it comes to a risk-based assessment of our models and how they can potentially impact our customers negatively. So all of this is now being studied as we speak. We have a committee that looks at that and is going to provide us with guidance on how to best tackle that. But I would say overall, the approach I'm seeing is extremely mature. It's got multiple lines of defenses, and it's exactly what you would want in a large company.
And just on that, the sort of data ethics team as well, I don't know if this is a silly question, but is that something that's mandated by the regulatory body, or is that something that's unique to Admiral and that's why you're so advanced in the ethics space?
I have to say, I don't know. I imagine that there are some regulatory requirements that perhaps you could meet purely by submitting to the regulators, say, adequate answers to what would be their questions.
Sure.
In this case, I feel Admiral did the right choice purely because they have within that team a lot of people that come from a data science background. So we're very lucky in that they not only understand the subject matter, so data science, but they also understand the impact
Right.
of what can go wrong when data science is not done properly. So again, overall, I think that is exactly the right approach, because as practitioners, they really know what they're talking about, but equally, they can put their, let's say, ethics hat on and say, okay, the model might give us fantastic accuracies predicting exactly what we want, but something that is not quite right, we need to go and fix it. And we have embraced that approach purely because we also know we have practitioners on the other side that are not there just to go about with a stick. They
Sure.
know what it feels like to do data science work, but they just also want to steer us towards the best outcomes within the boundaries that we deem ethical.
Absolutely. No, that makes complete sense. I guess moving forward and looking to the future as well, there's obviously continuous developments with AI. And since you're not necessarily in an academic sphere in your day-to-day work, how do you and your team stay on top of these trends?
So we have a weekly amount of time that we set aside with the team to stay on top of any AI developments, not just Gen AI. More recently, we looked into reinforcement learning.
Right.
I know that there is a lot of potential in causal AI, causal methods for inference. We're looking into probabilistic methods for ML. So it doesn't really have to be Gen AI only. Having said that, what I'm really excited about as the next phase of the Gen AI evolution is AI agents. That's where I think we still don't fully understand what potential that could bring to complex operations like you find in insurance. And just for the sake of clarity, what I mean by AI agents is instead of having a single LLM that on a zero shot basis just hits, say, it is hit with a prompt and is expected to spit an answer, and an AI agent breaks down a complex set of tasks into smaller tasks that a smaller LLM specializes in solving. So that approach requires a level of coordination between different LLMs that today I think is still not fully explored, but we're seeing some interesting papers coming out saying that the level of complexity that these networks of AI agents can solve is becoming more and more powerful. So maybe not next week, but as the maturity of the industry evolves, my bet would be that in the next 6 to 24 months, we're going to see something really meaningful coming from an AI agent's perspective. And so I'm making a point to keep my team as close as possible to new information that comes out, new papers, and try to review it at least on a weekly basis so that we
Wow.
don't really miss something that could potentially be transformative.
And you mentioned sort of researching papers. Are there any specific channels or sources of information that you guys use?
I would say deep learning AI for now has been one of the biggest sources for me purely because they already take some of those papers for you and they digest them in a structured way, saying, okay, this is what was studied, this is what the outcome was, and this is why we think it's important. Then, if you want, if it's an area of research that you're interested in, you can go deeper and look at the study yourself. But to give an example, there are an awful lot of advancements happening in computer vision. It is fantastic, it's exciting, but it's not really relevant to what I do day in, day out. So if there is something along those lines, maybe I would just read the headlines to see what's going on, but I'm not
Sure.
going to dig deeper. But if there is something instead related to agents, Gen AI, causal methods, it's definitely something I'm going to go and look into in more detail.
Amazing. Dario, that's it from my side. I really appreciate your time. I learned a lot on this conversation. I definitely think my listeners will too. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.